If you see a 9-9, Olga Korbut's won a gold medal. There it is.
5 seconds left in the game. Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
Hello, I'm Vince Hunt and welcome to our podcast series Sports in the Cold War. So far we've looked at more than 20 important themes in Cold War sports history, with plenty more to come. Why not follow the series on Twitter with the hashtag Cold War Sports, or rate and review the shows on iTunes, or drop Laura Deal an email at the Wilson Centre with your thoughts. Let's talk now about African sport and the opening of the Friendship Games held in Senegal in April 1963. Pascal Charitas is a sports historian at the University of Paris West in Nanterre, La Défense, and he's an expert on the Francophone influence on African sport. Tell me something about the Friendship Games.
The Friendship Games are 3 editions of French African Games organized by France. In fact, it's a transformation of something the French tried to do during the 50s, but in fact it couldn't happen because France have a colonial empire. So because you have the movement of independences in the 60s, especially for the former French colonies in Africa, so you have the good opportunity at this time in this context, and France with the goal is trying to take intermediate place, like a mediator between the two superpowers. And of course, for Charles de Gaulle, the French president, Africa is a mean to keep influence internationally, political influences, cultural, education, and also sport. That's why at this period, especially in 1960, 61 and 63, you have 3 editions of African sport organized by French state. The 2 first editions was only for the former French colonies and of course the French team. French team was winning all the competitions, of course. But the last editions is a turning point because in 1963 in Dakar, Senegal, because it's open to the former Anglophone African colonies. It's open to the Arabic countries of Africa, so in North Africa, and open to the women. So why? Because in 1963, Maurice Herzog, the High Commissioner of Youth and Sports for the French state, said France is going out. Now the African executives are alone. You can organize your own African games, but in fact, we know that French is always there, not by a team, a sport team, but always there by cooperation, technical support, financial support with trainers, for example. And so for the first games, African Games in 1965 in Congo-Brazzaville, no French team in sport, but a technical support behind, like other countries, like German, like Americans with Peace Corps contingent, like with, of course, the USSR too. So we can see Africa is becoming, during the beginning of the 60s, a new world. We called, of course, this world the Third World, but it's a new world for many influences with before bilateral relations and after multilateral relations. And of course, France, it's in this unstable world, is trying to keep its influence by many waves, like sport, of course.
Looking at the turbulent political background to all this, particularly in Africa and Francophone Africa, it must have been a very difficult situation to suddenly say to the African nations, well, we'll give you a hand if you like arranging a sporting tournament. How was that received by the Francophone countries?
We must talk before to the French politics about Africa to understand how it's going on sport in Africa, and especially in Francophone Africa, because the movement of Francophone independences in Africa is very specific, because in comparison to the indirect rule of the Anglophone Africa, the policy of the French state is about direct rule. So before the 60s, the French state have a control, again on the colonies, very direct control, racial control too, and many colonies in Africa, especially in Black Africa, would like to stay in the empire, but with some transformations, of course. We call that in 1958, with the Fifth Republic, the new Fifth Republic of France by Charles de Gaulle. We call that the Communauté Franco-Africaine, the French African community. It's like a little bit like a Commonwealth, like the British. But in fact, this kind of new structure is not working at all, because Charles de Gaulle was afraid, in fact, about the instrumentalization of this community, not by the Black Africans, but by the North Africans and the Muslim countries at the north. So he prefers, that's always a problem. In one hand, the Africans said, okay, we took our liberty, freedom, and in another way, Charles de Gaulle and the French people said, we leave freedom to the African executives. So you have always the both sides of the discourses, of course, about this situation. But in fact, so that's why when you can see all the historical dates, you have a huge moment, only in 1960 especially, of 14 former French colonies in Africa. They are going to be independent this year. In sport, that's why we can see a parallelism between these transformations of the French Empire at this time and the international relations, and how sport is following, in fact, the same way of French international policy and the French transformations of the empire.
Was this a successful policy, the Friendship Games policy of the French?
Yes, it was successful because it was the first time for the African sportsmen to have a continental competition and to be confronted to the other countries, because before it was colonies, so it was forbidden. So it's important because they can have an idea of the value of the performance, of the level of sport in their different countries. And the other thing is very important because these 3 editions of Friendship Games are a step to control again, of course, the former French colonies in Africa, but also to learn to influence these new countries, to learn about the Olympic values, to learn about all the rules, how many disciplines we can have, the referees, for example, the oath of the athletes, the opening ceremony, the final ceremony, etc., etc. All is made in these 3 editions, like in fact a small Olympic Games in Africa, but controlled by French state. So it's a huge step to learn Africa to go inside the IOC, because at this time you have during the 3 editions, in the same time you have French members from the IOC. And especially for the last edition in 1963, you have Avery Brundage, the American president of the IOC. So you have made a link between the French state, the IOC, to push Africa in the sports international scene. And especially why? Because the first African Games in 1965, when French team is not there, it's because the IOC is taking part in the African Games. And why? Because they don't want that the first African Games fall in the Soviet influence, especially because Brundage is American. So that's why. So they prefer behind to have English, British influence, German influence, and of course French influence instead of Soviet influence. Because we can keep in mind that the first Black African colonies we were independent in 1958 was Guinea of Sékou Touré, and it joined directly the USSR. So we have in the history many key understanding like that to understand the rest of the transformations.
So this was a careful policy by the French of withdrawal from a kind of empire position to one of friendship and assistance, so that they didn't inadvertently drive the former colonial administrations into the hands of the Soviets.
Not only from the hands of the Soviet, but also from the hands of the American with the Peace Corps too, because the France of de Gaulle is not very friendly with American and USA, so we know that. And the other thing is during these 3 editions of the Friendship Games, a French member of the IOC, Lecomte Jean de Beaumont, he was discussing with many African president sport federations, and he was trying to learn these African executives about the Olympic Charter and to create NOC. Again, because the French, they didn't want that we can say later that France didn't help their former colonies to integrate the IOC, but it could be American, it could be Soviet, so it's not possible because in fact this policy is building the Franco-African history again, but in a post-colonial transformations world, but not in the real colonial world, because like you said, it's a careful policy. So I'm using the concept of soft power in comparison to hard power. Hard power is more for the colonial period, and post-colonial period is more soft power because it's more influenced by cooperation, of course, because in the 60s when the former colonies from Francophone Africa became independent, you have automatically agreements of cooperation in many fields, nuclear, for the army, education, of course, sport too. So it was a way again to keep control, to have link, and of course the African executive are taking a part too inside these relations. They are not naive or they are not sleeping. They want to be proposed to the international scene and to go to the Olympic Games, because we do not forget that in 1964 at Tokyo for the Olympic Games, that's really, we can say that's really the first Olympic Games where we can see many African NOCs, the first time. Even if 1960 in Rome, we have the first one, like Ethiopia, for example, Libya. For Ethiopia, we can remember Abebe Bikila, marathonian sportsman, for example. But really, it's 1964 for the Olympic history that we can repair like a big date because of the integration, but because before we have the French Games, because we have the integration and the creation of the NOCs from French Africa. And in fact, the concept of soft power is coming from a concept of Joseph Nye. Is used to understand the American policy in the state in America. But I use this concept in international relations to understand how can we understand to pass from colonial period to post-colonial period with the transformations, and how the imperialism is changing, and how to Olympism. Olympism is another way to do imperialism behind.
So sport is being used by the French here as a method of keeping the former colonies on side, and yet at the same time it has a dramatic effect on the sporting world, because now we see the dawn of the new age of the African athlete at the Olympics.
Yes, if we are going more near our contemporary period, we can see that you have other structures. They can be a background for France and European countries to pick up some good athletes in Africa. For example, I have in my mind an example. I think it was in the Olympic Games in Beijing. The first medal of weightlifting is in fact at first a Cameroonian guy. So the French said to him, in fact, if you want to have good condition to be trained in your sport, come in France. So we have in France a big structure for the sport elites. It's called INSEP, and he had financial support. First, he was first medal of the African Games in his sport, and after, because he entered in a process of naturalization to become a French sportsman, and so he became after I think he won the 2 or second place in European championship in his sport, and after he for France, of course, and after he went to the World Championships, he did a medal too, and after he was competing for France to represent France in the Olympic Games in Beijing, and he did a medal for France. So, like you have Francophonie Games, it was creating in the 80s. It's with the African Games. The Francophonie Games are, a playground, behind structures of European and French in different sports, and they can sometimes trying to see, in particular, if in very weak disciplines, sport disciplines in France, we can find good athletes for the future in those disciplines in Africa.
You've been listening to a podcast from the series Key Moments in Cold War Sports History, a project bringing together experts from around the world and hosted here on the Wilson Centre's online digital archive at digitalarchive.org. These podcasts are part of the project The Global History of Sport in the Cold War, which is sponsored by the National Endowment of the Humanities, directed by Professor Bob Edelman of UC San Diego, Professor Chris Young from the University of Cambridge, and Dr. Christian Ostermann of the Woodrow Wilson Centre, and run in collaboration with the German Historical Institute Moscow, the Jordan Centre for Advanced Russian Studies at New York University, and Pembroke College, University of Cambridge. The presenter is Vince Hunt, and the series is produced by Vince Hunt and Laura Deal.